Hi, it's Brandon from Arabian Night Armory, and today we're going to be talking about chainmail. Now, chainmail is one of the oldest forms of armor, and has been around for a very long time. Chainmail was known even during the Roman Empire, when Rome was fighting against Celtic tribes. Presumably, they are the people who invented it, the Celts, although it's been around for so long it's actually difficult to pinpoint exactly where it came from. Chainmail went as far east as Japan, even. Um, so it's been used by quite a variety of cultures. Obviously, for good reason, it is an effective armor. And yet, it's very misunderstood armor, and in most portrayals, even in documentaries for History Channel, as it breaks my heart, and it's portrayed as being not very good. And part of the problem is that people buy costume armor or LARP armor, and then they get a misinformed idea of what proper battle armor is supposed to be like. So I have three different hauberks that I'm going to show you. I'm going to be technical. I believe two of these will be habergeon because they don't come down far enough. The main difference between habergeon or hauberk is length, so how far down your body it goes, and then to some degree if it's full sleeve or it's a half sleeve. But that is a whole other debate that we don't need to get into. So the first one, this is butted, which means the rings are made from a spool of wire that is then pinched together. The rings are not welded shut, they are not riveted shut. This is what most people who LARP or have costume armor are going to be wearing. So the disadvantage of that is because it is not riveted or welded, the rings are not truly solid. I can open a ring by taking a pair of pliers the same way that I can open or close them. So, and I can even do that with my fingers. If I take a ring off and I just pinch it and twist it, I can open a ring that way. So if it's that easy to open the rings, then it's also significantly easier to destroy the rings or to defeat the armor if it's on a person. One example that I saw on a History Channel documentary is they put this kind of costume chainmail on a log and then they chop it with an axe. And they're like, see, it's easy to defeat chainmail if you have the right weapon. No, wrong kind of rings, wrong kind of alloy. So this is a modern, people call it chicken wire. It's a zinc-plated spool. The problem with that is an alloy intended to be very ductile and malleable and soft. It's easy to bend. It's very forgiving to bend back and forth over and over. That is the exact opposite of what you want for armor. So getting a false conclusion of what armor is like through that is not a fair assessment for chaining. The other thing that I want to say about zinc-plated stuff is while it's very good at resisting rust, the downside is that zinc is actually very poisonous to the body in large concentrations. And I'm trying to fearmonger you. I don't want you to think that like a tiny amount of it is going to kill you. It's not. But if you're making your own hauberk, depending on if it's full sleeve or half sleeve or how big you are as a person, that's a 3, 5, 8,000 rings. That's a lot of dust of zinc if you're making them by spooling wire around like a wooden dowel and cutting individual rings. So instinctively you should not want to breathe that in because that's metal dust, and metal dust is going to cut your lungs up anyways. But yeah, large amounts of zinc will poison you, so don't mess with that stuff. Always wear a mask, always wear airtight goggles around your eyes, always clean contaminated surfaces when you're done working on it. For context on how much that weighs, that's, I believe, something like 18 pounds. The next one, this is carbon steel, which is why you will notice it has a different color. And there's also some brass rings on the ends of the sleeves and at the bottom to make it look pretty. So carbon steel is a hardened type of steel as opposed to the chicken wire stuff. So this is already out of the gate significantly stronger because of alloy. But you'll notice that the rings have rivets in them and that they're flat. So depending on what time period you're looking at, chainmail might be round rings, it might be flat rings, depending on what culture too. But the point is, because it's riveted, you can't just burst it open or bend it open when you impact it. You have to rip the rings apart. So that's a significantly more protective type of chainmail as opposed to butted. There is still something lacking in this middle hauberk. So the inside diameter of the rings is 9 millimeters. Now, this is a brush for painting. I can take this and I can stab it through the rings. And I can do that with the butted one as well. So, when people say that chainmail is very easy to defeat, when you use piercing weapons, that's because they're using inner diameter of 9 millimeters as opposed to 6 millimeters. And 6 millimeters is not even the narrowest. I've heard it come down to 4 or even 3 millimeters. For example, the one that I'm wearing is 6. This is the paintbrush, and it can't get through at all. I mean, I can even take it through my sleeve, and I try to poke it, and the paintbrush can't get through my sleeve, right? So just by having a significantly narrower inner diameter on the rings, you are creating a much denser weave of chainmail, which is dramatically more difficult to pierce through. Now, obviously this will never be as pierce resistant as plate armor, but also consider that plate armor is a more expensive, more advanced technology. If you're an empire, like the Roman Empire, or various Chinese dynasties, or various Turkish, Persian empires, you want to get armor very easy to mass produce, very cheap, and very easy to fit to the warrior. Plate armor, for it to work correctly, has to be fitted to the individual. But chainmail is actually more forgiving because of its flexible nature. So as long as the chest circumference is correct, the height is correct, the sleeve diameter is correct, it'll mostly be fine. You can have people that have a little bit of a gut on them, and if the chest is correct, it'll probably be fine. You can have people that are a little bit too skinny, and if you just add extra padding, it'll be fine. I can borrow this out to someone else who is a couple inches taller, a couple inches shorter. As long as the chest circumference is within 4 inches of mine, they'll be perfectly fine. That is why chainmail was so popular. As far as pierce resistance goes, what is it defined as exactly? If you have very narrow pointed daggers, that would actually be an excellent way of piercing with enough precision that you're only hitting a couple rings at a time and you'll get a stab through. But consider this. Metallurgical technology advanced significantly in the medieval period and especially the Renaissance as compared to the Dark Age and before that during the high points of the Roman Empire. If you're trying to make a very narrow pointed weapon, you need to have very, very good heat treatment and tempering so that that weapon doesn't just wet or bend like a wet spaghetti noodle when it comes into contact during battle. You need to have higher carbon than most of what things were made of during, say, 200 BC. So the weapons that chainmail was commonly fighting against, like Vikings, for example, those had a spatulated tip on the sword, which means it's a very wide, rounded tip. Now, having that mass on the tip means that it's not going to deform, which is good, and it also means that the end of that weapon, the last couple inches, still have a lot of chopping force, which is why Vikings liked having that. But when you think about that, if the tip is wider, that means it hits more rings when you try to stab, and that is a big part of why people get the impression that chainmail, or that's why people don't get a good impression of chainmail for its stab resistance. You have to understand, this was not coming into contact with a Renaissance period, very narrow, very hardened point. This was coming into contact, for the most part, with wider points. Now, a spear has enough mass behind it, and because it's got 2 hands on it from the wielder, if someone takes a running charge at you with a spear during the Viking era, 900, 1000 AD, somewhere in that vicinity, they're still going to stab you. It's not going to be like Assassin's Creed depicts it, where it goes through the front layer, through the padding, through your body, through the padding, through the back layer of chainmail, and then continues on for a couple inches. Like, that kind of Hercules strength, no. But it is able to stab enough that it could hit an organ, it could hit a lung, it could hit your heart, it could hit your intestines. That would either be a quick kill, or at least a slow, painful kill, but it is enough to kill. So, chainmail is not perfect. But like I was saying earlier, it's easy to mass produce, it's easy to fit to different people, it's easy to repair. I can teach people how to fix this in like 5-10 minutes, right? But if you think about how hard it is to make plate armor, that takes weeks, months to properly understand every step of the process. And even then, you still have to consider that you only know how to make that given style of plate armor that you learned. If I try to teach someone 14th century English armor, right? The kinds of shapes that you see in that are drastically simpler and easier than late 15th century Gothic armor from the Holy Roman Empire. That's a whole other skill set that you need to learn on top of that foundation you already have. Versus chainmail, I mean, the additional skills that you need to have are things like tapered fitting and expansion rows. So you see this very prominently in Indian armor and Persian armor, and you still see it somewhat in European armors. Lindy Beige, if you see him on YouTube, Lindy Beige has an excellent, authentic battle chainmail that he bought while he was overseas. So I adore that he had that, and he shows you that the way that his hauberk was made wasn't a barrel shape that goes around the torso and then sleeves were put on. The way that his was made is that you have like a trapezoid in the front and back, and then sort of triangles coming up the sides. Now, when you have chainmail like that, two things are happening. One, it alters how the rings pull on each other as the body moves as you're fighting, so it still retains a lot of flexibility but good protection. The other thing he notes is that the rings are not of uniform thickness or diameter. You see stronger, chunkier mail in some places, and then flimsier mail in others. And that is actually a pattern in armor making that existed for a very long time. The sections over your vital organs are going to be a heavier form of armor than at the sides, where if you get grazed in the ribs, it's going to suck, but you can survive getting stabbed between the ribs as long as it didn't hit your lungs or your heart or your kidneys. So chainmail has a lot of variety to it, even if it doesn't seem like it, because of the different ring diameters, different fittings, even the different patterns in the weave. What I'm wearing is the European style, which is 4-in-1, so if you think of it like a grid pattern, that's pretty much what it is. What you can see in Indian and Persian chainmail is that rather than doing a 4-in-1, they do like, I believe, a 5 or 6-in-1 pattern, and it sits as a sort of parallelogram that's tilted as opposed to a grid. And that tilted one, that's what I was talking about when I said there's like a funky trapezoid shape and a triangle shape. It's because of the way that the pattern is made. So that pattern, having more rings in a given square inch, is going to be a little bit denser, but you compensate for that by having differences in gauge and diameter, so you can have much more control over how thick that mail is. And if you think to yourself, well, okay, but having heavy-duty chainmail across the whole body sounds like a safer option. Maybe, but you should also consider the trade-off that in Europe you had cold seasons and hot seasons. So, you're fighting in England and the temperature is like 60 degrees outside, and you have some really heavy armor on, locking in more of your heat. That actually feels nice. I love fighting in armor when it's cold out because I stay at the correct normal temperature, right? But if you try to wear the heaviest armor possible when it's 96 degrees out in the desert, you're going to be crying. It's going to be brutal and agonizing. You're going to wish you fucking took off your armor because it's so bad. So that's why you have to have that trade-off for how much protection, how thick the metal is on different parts of the body, especially in those kind of environments. The last thing I'm going to talk about is why this armor that I'm wearing, this 6mm riveted chainmail, is darker. So it's a carbon steel just like the chainmail that I showed you before in the middle, but this one, the historical way that you blacken chainmail, or any armor for that matter, is that you take the metal, you dip it in an acid solution, and then you pull it out, you dip it in oil, and then you bake them. Now, what happens is, when you dip it in the acid solution, the surface of the metal gets slightly porous, so that it's ready to have another thing bind to it. So then, after you soak it in the acid solution, the amount of time that you soak it in depends on how strong that acid is, which will vary depending on what culture you're looking at. But after you soak it in, you put it in olive oil or linseed oil or something like that, kind of vegetable, fruit-based oil, something like that. And then you bake it. The outer surface of the chainmail becomes magnetite as opposed to regular iron or regular steel. Magnetite does not react very much with oxygen compared to regular iron and steel. So this, I can sweat and sweat and sweat and sweat in this armor, and it's not going to start falling apart from rust. It's going to be very resistant. This is also good because magnetite is still an iron-based alloy. It's still a very, very strong material. So if you compare that to powder coating metal or spray painting metal, that's paint on top of metal. Paint is not inherently strong. Paint you can scratch away, you can chip it away, it'll flake away over time. If two pieces of metal are spray painted and they rub against each other, the paint will fall apart. This, The magnetite is such a hard, strong material, chemically bonded to the regular iron or steel that might be underneath, that it's not going to rub off. Like, you have to grind the hell out of this for the magnetite to actually fall off of the, well, not even fall off, you're scraping it off of the iron or steel. So this is probably the chainmail that I'm going to keep fighting with for many, many years. If I get another hauberk, maybe I'll get one that's full sleeve. Maybe I'll get some voiders and a skirt for some gothic armor, because the difference between chainmail as it was worn by Milanese, so Italian, and Gothic, so German, Holy Roman Empire, is the Italians wore like a full-on hauberk underneath the plate armor, and the Germans figured that was kind of pointless because they had fluting on their breastplates and fluting on other parts of the armor, so they wore voiders on the armpits because it's kind of awkward to put plates on the armpits, and they wore chainmail on the skirt, so around the hips and here, you know, the important section, because you want to make sure that that is always protected, but you still need that area on your body to be flexible, so when you're running, you're jumping, you're crouching, you're riding a horse, you can still articulate your legs the way they need to move. But yeah, that is chainmail in its various forms, why it's been misunderstood for so long, and what you might want to learn about it. A final point that I'll say, I remember I mentioned the weight on the galvanized one being something like 18 pounds. This middle one and the one I'm wearing are both something like 23, 25 pounds. The middle one has longer sleeves, but the rings are a bigger diameter, so it's a looser weave. This one, tighter weave, but shorter sleeves. And I believe the overall length is a little bit shorter too, because it comes quite as far down my thighs. So yeah, it's not really that much heavier. Like, 23, 25 pounds is not horrible to run in. Actually, that should be my last point. The weight of armor for chainmail. People will make chainmail out of ridiculously heavy gauge, like 14 gauge or even 12 gauge, 8 gauge, oh my god. And the reason why is because, like I was talking about with that first hauberk, it's butted, it's not riveted, so you can bend the rings open to break it open. So LARPers, whenever they throw high shots or wrap shots, you'll notice that that's putting strain on the armpit. The armpits will just rip open, right? And that's just going to spread more and more and more. So to prevent that, they use a really thick gauge. But it's more, this is more protective at 18 gauge than a butted hauberk is at 14 gauge. So that's a difference depending on like the measurements of the person when you're comparing hauberks of like 10, 12 pounds. 10, 12 pounds less for better protection. Butted mail, it's great for costume work, it's great for a cheap introductory thing for LARPers, but it is hot garbage as far as protection goes, especially protection to weight ratio. Anyways, I'm Brandon from Arabian Night Armory. Check us out on Patreon, on YouTube, on our Facebook page, and have a good day.